I like to think personally that the way or the real reason behind the sprint planning is that you're setting yourself up for success. Is that you and your team are planning out how are we going to succeed in this sprint. And good sprint planning is going to make for better opportunities or abilities to achieve success. Because we achieve success or failure as a team, and so as a team, we need to work together to figure out what is it that we need to do in order to succeed. And that's why we pause at the beginning of every sprint to figure that out and to make sure that we can achieve it. And so we do this at the beginning of every sprint that is typically about 3 to 4 hours because it really demands the dedication of you and your team to figure out exactly what is it that we want to do and why, and also in tandem with the product owner and the product management and also the vision and goals of the entire organization, as well as any other teams who are depending on us and what we might be doing that they are blocking. We want to make sure that we are in full coordination. And so instead of just looking at our feet and constantly running forward, sprint planning is that opportunity to pause and say, where do we want to go? What are we targeting? And how are we going to get there? And is that the most important place we want to be? And if you remember from my burn down charts example, the analogy I used was running. We could, in a typical project management, just be running and running and running, staring at our feet, and we'll be going somewhere. And we might have a very long term goal in mind, like a marathon. But the beauty of running in a very agile structure is we run in these sprints. And at the end of every sprint we do, we can slow down our run or pause completely and say, all right, where are we going now? Look at where we've been and look at where we want to go next. What obstacles lie in front of us? What is the most important target that we want to reach? Is the product owner and everyone else in agreement? Is that where we want to go? And then we can go and execute and drive towards those targets. And that's in very much the mindset of what the sprint planning is setting out to do. So how we go about to do this then, our best laid plans may not all succeed as we envisioned. It is quite possible that, and we know that as we start working on the sprints, work becomes incomplete or things become bigger than we thought. Some things get little and some things get just no longer necessary, or new things are new and necessary. And so, what I'm talking about here is really in an ideal world, we would have a very clear understanding in a backlog so that we could lay everything out. But even in a perfect world, it is very common and probably conceivable that we were not going to get everything done in a sprint. We're not 100% predictable. That is just the reality of work. That's if we are an assembly line, maybe then that would be the way. But we are knowledge workers, and we are in a field that has a lot of variability and new things. The world does not stand still. New things come in, new things come out, and so there is going to be some changes. And so even though we've put everything in the big room planning and laid them out, it is conceivable that, especially in the later sprints, that's not going to happen. And my point here is that if something is not completed, I mean, technically, it should go back to the backlog. That's because we need to figure out, one, is it, even though it wasn't complete, should we still complete it? Does it still have its importance? Maybe because of what was worked on, we determined it has no place anymore in our objectives, or possibly the work that was worked on it has no longer deemed necessary, but maybe potentially later. But most times, and quite typically, we just move it to the next sprint. So it's in that ensuing sprint because we are under the understanding that we came this far and we'll probably want to keep going towards it. But I say this because it is not a guarantee. And I often see with some teams is that we keep pushing the can down the road. And the idea of plans is that we want to set out what is achievable in a sprint. We're not just saying, well, we'll eventually get to it when we get to it, and we'll just keep working towards it, and then eventually we'll achieve it. If that was the case, then that's traditional project management. That is just what we'll use Gantt charts for, and we'll just set an estimate and we will just keep adjusting the schedule accordingly. Sprints, by design, are meant to be where we try to plan out everything that needs to be done and can be done within that time boxed period for us, which is 10 days. We do not just create a story that is so large or not decomposed enough or well understood enough where we just kind of work on it and eventually we get to it. And so when we are planning, you and your team need to take the inputs, yes, from the backlog, everything that is existing in there. And that includes the things that were incomplete. And so that's the input. You're taking in the backlog. And so what's important is in the backlog is that the product owner is prioritizing what is the most crucial or the most important or most meaningful in that backlog. And that is what we're using as our primary driver as decision maker for what we should do as a team in any given sprint. We also have to take a look at what was not finished up to this point that we already planned, as well as, of course, all that effort we did in big room planning to make sure that we are aligned with all the other different teams in our organization, as well as what we had paced out for the given PI. So these are all the inputs that we take in. We take in our expectations from the big room planning. We take in the material that is our core source, which is the product backlog, which again is everything that we think we need to do. Every feature, every story, it even has the capabilities, but it's really your organic document that, or uh, that artifact that is trying to articulate everything that we need to accomplish as a team. And then we also, of course, need to look at the things in the backlog that we have not yet completed, or incomplete 10.3 example, that story was nearly completed but was not. But really, as you can see here, these inputs are necessary for us to have a good sprint planning. So even before we get to the sprint planning, the power or the importance of a good backlog refinement ceremony is completely critical, because this is what is going to set your project your sprint planning up for success. So you're setting up for success before you set up for success for that sprint. If your backlog is your primary input and it captures everything that your product owner and your organization is looking for as a need, you as a team and you as a scrum master are looking towards this artifact as the primary source. Now, yes, you can ask questions, you can get the information, but that's what this backlog refinement is. And that's a whole different ceremony. And that's a topic for another mindset series. But just to emphasize is that is why we have that backlog refinement session or sessions in every single sprint, because it's like the pre-planning for the sprint planning. And I was even working with some teams that said they don't do this, or they haven't been able to catch up enough to perform this backlog refinement sessions, and they end up doing it during the sprint planning. Well, sprint planning, though, the idea is that if you came to sprint planning with a well-groomed backlog that has clarity on what is needed to be done, and the product owner can articulate this is why we want things done, or this is what is meant by these particular features and these stories, and there is understanding of what it's going to take, and the stories are properly sized, but more importantly, that it is current. The backlog has to be current because things change. This is not just a to-do list that remains static from the BRP or from the last sprint. Things are going to need some revision because things from the last sprint have influenced what has, maybe what was completed in that last sprint or the last sprints, or what was not done is going to impact the backlog. And also the information that's coming in from outside the project team, or the work that needs to be done, or maybe like you hear with level one planning, all these different inputs. This backlog needs to be groomed in order to set up, or, like I said, like a pre-planning to set us up for success. So when we move to the time dedicated to sprint planning, we can really focus in on the most current, most accurate information and reliable information with the priorities already established as much as possible and everything else, so that sprint planning can focus on sprint planning. So then the whole purpose of sprint planning is trying to make sure that we are setting up achievable, realistic targets for us as a project team to be able to deliver in that sprint. So as a team, led and facilitated by our Scrum Master, is holding this conversation with everybody from our team. It is meant to be a collaborative effort so that we as a team, in coordination with our product owner, are all meeting together. And ideally, we were doing this face to face because we all need to be working as a team. Because I'll say this one more time, is that we succeed or we fail as a team in the Agile framework. And that mindset needs to be there. Too often I've seen the sprint planning ceremonies really not be a ceremony. It's more of a working day. People go off, make some tasks. They maybe come back at the end of the day and they say, okay, looks good, let's start working. You're losing the deeper connection and the intention of sprint planning. Because if we are all to be together and understanding of what needs to be accomplished, what are the goals and the objectives of this sprint, that is a collective effort. And we need to be working, even if our abilities and type of work that we do may not be exactly the same as somebody else on my team, it's still incredibly important for me. If I'm a part of a team, I need to know what you are doing and you need to know what I am doing. And we need to all understand what we are doing together that achieves the goals and the objectives and what we're trying to take from the product backlog, because the product backlog has value. Otherwise, why would anything be in the product backlog? And so for us, the things that we work on have value, and we need to understand how that value fits in the grander scheme of things and what makes things important. So when we take then the stories, we need to pile on the stories that we as a team collectively have the capacity and the ability to achieve. And so we need to look at then what can we know and what do we understand. And again, if we really vetted out and really had great conversations in the backlog refinement about the stories and features already in the backlog, when we get here, we understand more of what these stories need to do, why they need to do it, why they are prioritized ahead of others, and we can try to take those on in a sprint. But granted, we can't take everything on. So that's why decisions need to be made. Maybe we can't take it on because the story is just not achievable, because maybe it's missing information. Maybe it is going to face some blockers that make it impossible. Or maybe we haven't done the stories that are necessary prior to that story. Maybe there is not enough information for us to move ahead, that the clarity is not there. Or maybe it's from product ownership saying, we've changed priorities. Maybe this is not as important as we thought, or we've got other things that are more pressing or more needful. But the conversation has to happen. And a sprint planning session or ceremony is really partially a conversation. It is an agreement. By the time we walk out of sprint planning, we should all be in agreement that these are the most important things that we should work on as a team and that we can achieve in this sprint. We don't want to set ourselves up for failure by taking on more work than we know we can take on. We don't want to set ourselves for failure if we're taking on work that is not important, or we don't have enough information, or just there's going to be elements within it that are probably going to make us not be able to deliver it. And this is why we really stress to you that take your stories and really decompose them into those those bits or those nuggets of value that you're attempting to achieve, because this will make it easier for you and your team to be able to sort out what is necessary, what can be done. And remember, stories should be sprintable. I've heard many conversations recently about how many stories are spanning sprints. That's against the whole principle, is that you are setting out. If I said you're going to go from here and you're going to run to that flagpole, well, you can't come back and say, well, that flagpole was way too far, so I just ran to the end of the driveway. That's not the point. And and remember, stories are meant to deliver value. And is there any value for you to run to the end of the driveway? No, the value was for you to get to the flagpole. Or maybe yes, if the value was for you to get to the end of the driveway, then why wasn't that a story? I would rather you see the value that you are developing and creating and planning for, instead of trying just to plot work on your docket. It's extremely important that the planning of a sprint is around what is the value that we are seeking, that the product owner and you as a team are all in agreement that these are the most important things, the most valuable things, and achievable things that we can do within a sprint. And that is also why we take a look at your capacity. Again, that's a different topic, but I will touch on it briefly here. Is that as a team, we collectively tally up the capacity. We know the formula and everything else. Again, I'm not going to get into that today, but I wanted to just emphasize why we go through that practice of, at the beginning of a sprint. Now, that what we may have entered in our capacity planning previously does not mean it is exactly the same on day one of our sprint. We need to confirm, if nothing else, that capacity that we have guessed or entered is still the same. And as a team, if we can collectively handle 40 story points, and we're looking at our velocity over, say, the last three sprints, and we've been clocking in around 30 story points every single sprint, well, then when we look at our stories, that's where that information comes or is helpful in assisting us in understanding how many stories we can take on as a sort of a range or a rule of thumb. But that capacity, though, the first day of sprint planning, you need to confirm that you have not changed in terms of the team's capacity. Are there any days off or unscheduled time off during this, or holidays, or whatever the case may be? But it's very necessary that, if nothing else, you reconfirm what capacity elements or capacity levels you've put in there, so that everything is again set up for success. And so when you walk out of there in sprint planning, the day one, we are all saying that this is achievable within our capacity. Sure, some team members might have to take on more responsibility this time, and some may take less. But as a team, we are all working together, striving towards delivering every single thing that we are promising to in a given sprint in the sprint planning. So to do this, then, we also need to make sure that we really well understand not only the objectives of these sprints and the stories within them, but also what is it going to take from us as a team to do it. Hence, we need to define and determine all the tasks that are necessary to meet the commitments that we've set. And the tasks, then, we might not know every single task that is necessary. We may not discover them until we start working on them. That's understandable. But the more of the tasks that we can define and estimate in terms of how long it's going to take, the more successful our team is going to be, because the more clarity we're going to have in terms of achieving those stories. And we may find during the decomposition of these tasks, we may have more than we've thought we've taken on. Or maybe we realize, as we start breaking down the tasks, we've got more stories here than just one. or this is going to be much bigger than we ever thought, or this is actually going to be easier than we thought. But the more that you and your team can break down the stories into tasks, and quite often too, I find it disturbing when I see a story that says perform XYZ, and the task is perform XYZ. That is defeating the purpose. If all I'm doing in this task is reiterating the exact same thing that the story is saying, then I may not have, or at least it's telling me when I look at that, that the person working on that maybe is not able to communicate all the work that needs to be done to the rest of the team. And this is why we do this tasks definition um, most, if not all the time, MVP. And I want to emphasize that, you know, we are going to break these tasks and try to determine them as a team. And if nothing else, I know that many of the tasks are determined by certain subject matter experts, but I should still be aware of the work that's going to be necessary to get that done, because maybe I can lend a hand, or maybe I can appreciate the work that they're taking on. But if I see that it's just one task or no task, I mean, obviously you can't have no tasks in there because the system won't let you move on. But it's very important that you have tasks that are determined as much as possible. Because yes, we have the tasks, and but we also need to make sure that we are having a good sense of how much effort it needs to take. But these are guesses. They are, you're estimating. We're not looking for perfection. And I want to emphasize that the whole point of doing these tasks and entering them in ALM is not resource planning. It is not try to micromanage you. The tasks are for the team, by the team. The team are the ones who, because there's not a need to micromanage, because as the product owner and the product management said, this is what we need to be done, and this is the negotiations we've had as a team to say, yep, we can do these things, then the team then can huddle around and figure out what it needs to take to get there. And so they are the ones owning these tasks. They are the ones that will oversee them and do them and make sure they're completed. The product owner doesn't really need to be involved in this part of it at all, unless there is questions or concerns or some kind of assistance. But the product owner is not determining these tasks. The team should be determining these tasks because they're the ones who need to do it. They might consult with the product owner, but they are the ones who need to figure out what needs to be done. The product owner is saying, in acceptance criteria, this is what I will accept. This is what I'm looking for. So if the story was to make a painting, I'm going to say, as a product owner, I'm going to accept a painting that is a landscape and has at least 2 apples in it. But the tasks, then, the team is determining what they need to do. And the more they can break down those tasks, the easier it is for them to plot their progress, to be able to communicate what needs to be done. But even to themselves, they start to realize, wow, I got to do that. Oh, that's right. I got to do this. Okay. And make sure that they don't forget anything, and make sure that they are able to maybe set their own little mini schedule within this story to be able to get a sense of sequence and a logic behind it. But we're not looking at your tasks, anyone except you and your team, to know what you and your team need to do. And if I can break these stories down to more tasks and I can't get to a certain task and I've written it well enough, maybe I could have help. I can pass it off easier instead of just having one big task that, maybe I wrote down takes 40 hours, which is, I don't see how that's even possible. You really want to target your tasks to be under a day. You can have even 15-minute tasks if you want. It's like your to-do. It's your checklist to see how you are doing towards the story achievement. And so based on that, with these tasks, we are able to understand the amount of tasks that are necessary. So one, that lets us know, did we really understand the story well enough? Did we size it correctly enough? Because we may need to make some changes in terms of what we've taken on as the load of this sprint before we get out of sprint planning, because we're setting ourselves up for success now so that starting day 2, we can execute on these stories so that we don't have to be distracted. We don't have to return to planning, that we could stay focused and focus in on the work that we need to do as a team. We need to try to vet all of this out in sprint planning. That's why we dedicate this time for you to do this. And so by having not only the stories, but the tasks well defined and maybe making changes to the stories, because this is your time. Make those changes, make those corrections, split stories now, because we don't want you to have to do that or make excuses for doing that at sprint review when you realize you didn't achieve anything. You need to look at those things now so that when we have those tasks, we know what lies ahead. It allows us to better collaborate. It helps us to communicate better because everyone on the team knows all the work that's needed to be done. And granted, yes, more tasks may emerge as we progress because stories do expand, new things do evolve. That is why we have that reserved capacity, is to try to take on those pieces. That is understandable, and that's why it's important too, when I understand those new tasks, I am also are entering those new tasks and estimating the hours that are associated to it so that I can communicate again with myself, my team, and product ownership and the organization as a whole, so that we know why things are taking maybe longer than expected, or maybe we have that learning so that the tasks that are identified, if we repeat a similar story in the future, we have those tasks already identified from this sprint so that when we repeat similar stories later, we can use and leverage that information and make sure that we don't fall into the same traps, or that it really gives us essentially a template for these new stories so that, again, we're setting up for success in the next planning. That is why, too, the whole Agile and Auto Scrum framework, we as a team get better and better every single time we do this. Yes, the first few times are going to be tough and they're going to be challenging and they're going to be frustrating and it's going to be time consuming, but that's fine. We're learning. And if we spend the effort on this and such things as, decomposing the tasks and then using these tasks throughout the sprint, it is giving us more and more information, and it's building this collective knowledge base that's only going to enhance our abilities to do more and greater things. And so here's the acceptance criteria. This is the objectives or aims of these stories, and collectively as a sprint, these are the goals. We've set these stories to align to those goals and those needs, and we have looked at all the tasks that are necessary to achieve that. The sprint planning is not just about story assignment. This is not where we're going to dictate who needs to do what and then move on. Because some of you have said, well, our sprint planning can take an hour. Well, maybe because you're doing it incorrectly. The sense I get is that it is just purely an assignment. That is not the point. The point is we get together as a team, understand what needs to be done as a team. We, as a team, as a self-organizing team, we have determined what we can achieve. Yes, there's some back and forth and arguments and negotiations and hand-wringing with our product owner, and our product owner should be very involved and trying to drive and give that sense of urgency and everything else that's involved in the conversation. And it should be an agreement between all parties, but it should not be dictated by the product owner or product management. It should be something that we all feel happy and confident in that we can do in any given sprint. And the more of that time we do this together as a team, the more aligned we are all going to be as a team. And then hopefully we can protect the plans that we have set forth through the rest of the sprint. Because if we're going to set ourselves up for success, we should then know exactly what we need to do for this sprint and then be allowed to go do it. Now, before I get into that, I just want to call out then is when we use the word ownership or owns a story. Well, every story should be owned by the product owner, but I want to just emphasize one thing. Many of you have heard of RACI, right? That's the responsible, accountable, consult, and inform. It's something we use in human resources and in almost every field. So you may or may have not heard of this before. But to associate it to what we're doing in sprint planning is that if you are the accountable person, what we say is by assigning you as the owner of that task or even as that story, we are just purely stating that you are the one accountable, meaning you're the point person. If we have any questions about this task or the story, we'll go to you. And because of that, you are also the one to make sure that the information is updated, that the time spent on a task is entered. Even if more people were working on it or other people were working on it, they can enter information, but it is your responsibility, your accountability to make sure that information is added, even if it's you adding all the information. But you are the primary point of contact on that story or that task, but there could be many other people responsible for making those tasks completed or anything else that's necessary to get the story's value achieved. And so you need to make sure that there's one accountable person, but there could be many responsible person, or this could just be one person who's the owner and the one responsible for doing the work. But that might help you kind of see the difference there in terms of when we say owner, we're really just looking at who is the accountable person and not necessarily the one who has to do the work. And I think that I've noticed has been a mindset issue is that people think, it's an assignment and I do the assignment because I am the owner and I am the only one who can do it. No, that's not the case. We are a team. And if we're going to really work as a team to achieve what we need to do, then we need to work together. And the C, if we're going to continue this analogy or this connection, consult would be any of the teammates you need to collaborate with or consult with or talk with, the product owners and other teams, all that would be people who you consult with. And then inform would be those other teammates that you're a team. And you might feel that we just are people with our own little silos but we call ourselves a team. If that is how you're feeling, probably understandable why you are not doing your sprint planning as a team, because you really are not working as a team. The emphasis I've made throughout is that you are a team. You must be aware as a team, you must work together as a team, and you must succeed as a team. And so a lot of that success or failure of every single sprint begins with the sprint planning. And with that, then is that the more we understand the work that needs to be done and having a good, refined, and groomed backlog, even coming into the sprint planning, then spending that sprint planning, having the really comprehensive conversations with the the product owner and our team to figure out what needs to be done, why does it need to be done, what's the expected outcome, what are the acceptance criteria, what's the description. This is why we put so much information in ALM, is to have that communication artifact, that we have everything that we want to collect and communicate. We want it there for many different reasons. Primarily, we want to make sure that we are knowing what we need to do so that we can do it. I'll segue here for a second, because sprint planning, the purpose too, is the more comprehensive we understand the desired outcomes and the goals of this sprint, we have figured out all the things that we agree on that need to be done and why they need to be done, and we have determined the tasks that are going to make sure that it's achievable to do before we even step out. It's before we even leave the house and begin on our journey. We want to be able to get those aims understood and making sure that we can actually get to where we want to go. Now, the other thing, though, too, is that teams, and this comes from one of those roles of a Scrum Master, is to try to protect the team. And also the product owner should be aware that the protection of a sprint is incredibly important, because these are the stories or the value that we are creating. And if we can achieve everything that we've promised and feel confident in order to deliver, Then when we get to sprint review and demonstration on the final, or typically the final day of a sprint, we should be able to have all of that completed. What happens though is that if product owners, product management, and scrum masters don't help protect these sprints plans, well, then we are going to be throwing new things in that wheelbarrow that wasn't part of the plans. We're going to be knocking it over. We're going to be bringing in new things. And I've heard these conversations from many teams is that, well, we get so much work during the sprint and then we don't know who to give it to. Point is that as a team, we've determined that these are the things that we want to do in a sprint. We've all come in agreement and we need to try to provide the guardrails for our team to be able to deliver everything that they promised and not be distracted. Sure, we don't work in a bubble. Sure, and this isn't a perfect ideal world, but in the agile mindset is why we do things in these short iterations is so that we can have that attention to what we need to do. We have the ability to focus in on what you as a product owner and product management said is the most important and as we as a team can do so that we can go do it. The more you distract us, the more you put new things that come in or new things that are needing immediate attention, some of that could be absorbed by our reserve capacity. That's why we put it in there. There is some times where, yes, some things may not go as planned. But the more that we can minimize those outside distractions, the more likely we're going to succeed, the more predictable and more stable we're going to be. And that's why we also have those metrics. But good metrics, only tell part of the story. Most of it in the perfect world is what we're looking at here is we know what we want to commit to, we can execute on those, and then we can celebrate our successes. And so that is why we have the sprint planning. That's why, again, the reports start to run after that first day is because we are wanting everything understood and determined that first day and committed to, so the rest of the days can just be focused on getting those committed items complete.